There is nothing worse than that drowning feeling you get when you have an error in a formula and you just don't know the first step to take in order to find the solution. Fortunately, knowing what to do is totally within your reach. In fact, I'm going to show you everything you need to know in this video. The vast majority of errors made in writing formulas, even for the pros, is tiny little typos. And it's easy to trick yourself into thinking that there's a more complicated issue going on when the real problem is just that you're missing a comma or a parentheses or something super simple. So I've organized this video to cover the most common errors first and then to get more specific over time. At the end, we'll talk about how to troubleshoot longer and more complicated formulas, but don't skip ahead because even if you're writing a more complicated one, just like everybody else, you probably just made a typo. So let's get into it, but first, take a deep breath. The two most important skills you need to be a pro at troubleshooting formulas are patience and the confidence to know that you will figure it out. And you will. So know that I believe in you, and let's get started. So here I've got a base with a list of pro basketball players from the year 2009 on the Boston Celtics. And you can see in the first three columns here that we've got their name, the year that they were playing, and the team name. And in the first column, the primary field, I want to show all of those things so that there's a unique identifier for each of these records, each of these rows shown here. And so the way that I did that, if I open up this formula, is by using a concatenate formula to combine these three different fields together with some text punctuation in between. And so this is going to bring us to, because this formula is using all these different types of punctuations that we typically use in formulas, this is a good example for us to go through by far the most common punctuation mistakes that people make when writing formulas. So if I click on the concatenate function here, I get this little yellow bubble to the left, which shows what we call the documentation. This is what the instructions that tell us how to use this function. So you can see the instruction up here, and then a description, and then at the bottom, an example of how you might use it. And so if we look back up at the instructions, basically you take different pieces of text separated by a comma and enclose it with closing parentheses, and you get a string of text like we have here. So by far the most common mistake that folks make, and obviously formulas can get a lot more complicated than this, but the most common mistake is missing a open or closing parenthesis or a quotation or a comma. And so if we look here, I'm going to start with parentheses. If I put my cursor right next to this opening parenthesis, Airtable automatically highlights the corresponding closing parenthesis. And this is super useful when you have multiple functions nested within each other. I'll have an example of that later on because you might have multiple open and closing parentheses nested within each other, and it might get confusing as which one corresponds with which function. Second is quotations. So you can see here that I have a single quotation, and then I also have the more common double quotations here. And you can see both of these work. You can use two different types of quotations in the same function, but you need to use at least one of them when you put any text into a function. So any text that you're going to put in must be enclosed in quotations. And that's super important because otherwise the computer has no way to distinguish the text that you actually want to end up in the finished product in the cell versus the actual logistical punctuation that it's using to write the formula, right? So because you have a parentheses here and here that are actually part of the function, and you also have this parentheses here, which is the text that you want to end up with, because I have these parentheses that show up around the year of that they're playing. There's one other issue we run into with quotations, which is that sometimes if you copy and paste some quotations from outside of Airtable, somewhere you found on Google, on the internet, you'll end up, instead of with these straight up and down quotations, with a curly quotes. And I'll paste something in so you can see what that looks like in Airtable. it looks kind of just barely curly. But if I do this, even if I put my, let's see, I got to put it inside my function here, get my comma. You can see everything inside these quotations here is green. This did not turn green, and if I hit save, it's going to tell me there's an error. And so just if you're pasting text from outside of Airtable, you need to watch the type of the quotation. So if I go in here and type in a normal single quotation, the thing is fine. And you can see that blah at the end there. Lastly, we've got commas. And so in the concatenate formula, the commas are pretty simple. We're just separating any number of items that we're going to string together. In other formulas, we have a very specific order of items that we need to pass to the function in order for it to make a calculation. And the number of commas and where the commas are placed can very easily get messed up. And so you really want to go through. The first thing I always do if I have an error is go through and look at the parentheses, the quotations, and the commas. Like we already saw with the text, Airtable helps us out by color coding the different types of information we have in our formula. So you can see in the text, I said it was green. It might actually be blue. The colors are actually very close together. But the text is this blue-green. We've got the function itself, which is green. And then the fields, so any fields like these fields here that we reference are purple. And then numbers, if we write numbers, are like a brown orange. Speaking of the fields, one last thing I want to call your attention to here is that this field in the middle, the team name, has brackets around it, but these other fields here do not have brackets. Any field can have brackets, but if you have multiple names separated by a space, you must have brackets around the field name. So here in the first name, I can put brackets around it and it'll turn purple again, and that's all good. It also works without it because since it's just one word, Airtable is okay with that. But as soon as you separate two words from each other, it needs to know that they come together, because you might also have a field that's called team and you might have a field that's called name, and so it'll be confused as to which one you're talking about unless you clearly show that those two words are together. And so that's what you're doing here. So we've already covered probably 80% of all errors that people make with formulas. The next thing I want to talk about is back on these different types of data, because if I X out of here, we can now look at all of these different types of data we have in our spreadsheet. We've got text, we've got the year, which is a number, the single select fields, and the age, all these different numbers, currency. And Airtable handles different things like text, numbers, and dates differently. So I'm gonna swipe over to this other base I have, and this is actually a list of all the different field types, right? So we've got single line text, phone number, currency, regular number, all of these different fields that we use in our Airtable base. And then here we have the data type. And you can see that the most common 4 data types, and I think these are going to be the most important ones to writing formulas, are string, which is text. That's the computer definition for a string of text. We got numbers, we've got dates, and then Boolean. And a Boolean means like true or false. And so that a checkbox, if you want to reference a checkbox in a formula, you're going to use Boolean values, true and false. I'll just scroll down so you can see these other field types. And when we get into arrays, that's a little more complicated. We can cover that in another video. But most formulas are going to be dealing with these first 4 types. So knowing these data types is really useful when you want to manipulate them in different ways, because, for example, we can't do math operations like multiply, divide, text, right? Even if there is a number in a text field, Airtable may confuse that. If you try to multiply 10 that's in a text field by 2, if it's going to recognize it as text, then it won't be able to do the calculation. And Airtable is actually really smart, so sometimes it preempts your error, and if you only have numbers in a single line text field, it actually will do the calculation. So this isn't always a problem, but it's important to be aware of that because sometimes you will run into an issue there. The other most common issue is working with dates. So to use an example of how we could confuse a date with a number, I'm going to go back into our example base here, go to the second tab. So I've got a list of invoice dates here, and let's just say I want to know the day after the invoice was created. So if I create a new field here, I'm going to call this day after. This is a formula. And so if I were to take the invoice date and then just want to add one, right? I just want to add one day, create field, and I get, not a number because I'm confusing a date with a number, right? Airtable doesn't know what one does. Does it mean 1 minute? Does it mean 1 month? And so I need to use some kind of function that actually takes a date. So for this example, I can use a DATEADD function. So I will start typing DATEADD. And then I'm going to say, so the DATEADD takes the date time, a count. So that's our 1 day that we're going to add, and then the unit. So let's say I'm adding 1 day. So I'm going to use invoice date 1 day or days. And so we'll close that off, hit save, and sure enough, that adds a day. So I'm going to delete that because now what I want to talk about is what we do with troubleshooting a more complicated, bigger formula. So let's pretend for this example that I work in accounts receivable at a company. So I create invoices, I invoice customers, and I'm the person who's responsible for collecting money from them. So I have a list of invoice dates here, and I want to know the last day of the month each of these invoices was created in so that I can compile a list of paid invoices and unpaid invoices all within the same month. So what I had tried to do here was to write this formula that finds the last day of the month that this invoice was created in. And it looks like I got partway there. These do look like the ends of that month, but it's in the wrong year. So I'm looking at this formula. There could be lots of different reasons for that because there are so many functions. So how do I solve this problem? And the answer for anything that's overwhelming is to break it down into little pieces. So what I want to do is I want to just think through this whole process from the beginning to the end, and I'm going to use each of these functions in their smaller component, and then hopefully find what the error is so that I can then combine them into this larger function. So to find the end of the month, what do I have to do? It's easy to find the first of any month, right? Because it's always the first. It doesn't change between the 30th, 31st, 29th, whatever. So the first thing I want to do is get that first of the month, and I can do that by using the datetime format function with some regular text. So let's go into here, and the datetime format function takes a date, and then you can output the components of that date in any way you want, and it outputs text. So real quick aside here, one of the most common issues that people run into when they're working with formulas is confusing text and dates because the datetime format function specifically takes a date in and outputs text. So if you then try to use a datetime format function inside of a DATEADD function, you often run into errors. The solution to that problem is using a datetime parse, which is what we're going to do next. So first, though, what I want to do is use a datetime format to take the month and the year, right? Because those are going to be the same as the first of the month. They're going to share the month and the year, but they have a different day. So what I want to do is I'm going to, just in quotations, I'm going to say 01, which is the day. And then I'm going to say, and datetime format, and we'll take the invoice date. And then looking at here, it takes the date and then the format string. So the string that I want, that's got to be inside quotations, is month year. So we're doing, this is like a British formatting. Day, month, year. And I'll put the closing parentheses, hit save, and we've got day, month, year here. So now that we've got this, we can use a datetime parse function to turn what Airtable is recognizing as text into a recognized date. So let's open this one up. First of the month, date, I called it. Okay, and we're gonna write a datetime parse function. So with datetime parse, we take a string, and then we take a format, and optionally you can have a locale. And actually, if you look at these little brackets here, these brackets signify that it's an optional field. So it looks like we actually don't even need to put a format in. We can let Airtable guess what the format is and see if it gets it right, but it's not too hard for us to actually tell it. So I'm gonna tell it. So I've got my date string here, and then I'm gonna tell it that we are gonna format this as day, month, year. Close it off, save. All right, and there we go. There's our first of the month. So what we want to do now to get the last of the month is we're going to add 1 month in this column, and then we're going to subtract 1 day here. So for this one, right, we had June 29th. This first of the month function brings us to June 1st. So then we'll add a month to get to July 1st, and then subtract 1 day to get to June 30th. So let's open this up, and we'll create a DATEADD. We'll take the first of the month date and add 1 month to it. And then we'll do the same thing here, except subtract a day. DATEADD, take the first of the next month and subtract 1 day. So this worked. So now that this worked, let's actually just string them all together into a new function. So I'm going to insert a new formula. We'll say altogether 2. This is a formula, and I'm just going to put some quotations in here to hold the place. And so I'm actually going to start at the end so that I can put stuff inside it. So I'll copy this, paste it in, get rid of our time that was included here. And then I've got the date, subtract the day. So then now I need to put this one inside of that. So I'll take this, and then when I look at my function here, that's going to replace this, the first of the next month, right? Because that's how we got that, that value. So we'll put that inside it, save. This is still working. Now I want to take the first of the month here. So let's take this. We'll put it inside here, the first of the month date. Save. And then lastly, let's take the first of the month text. Put that in here. And now the only thing that we're referencing is the invoice dates, the beginning, and it worked. Hey, that's awesome. And so that is how I would recommend putting together a longer nested formula, because it's a way to check each step and to not run into errors that you need to troubleshoot later. If we actually just wanted to see what's wrong with this one, we can look at it here compared to this one and see that this second, within the datetime parse function here, our formatting was off. Obviously, I knew that because I made this wrong on purpose. And so we can add these in here and get it to work just like the other one did. But often you've got a kind of a confusing medley of stuff and you don't exactly know what you did. And so breaking it into pieces is going to help you out hugely in that regard. All right, so that's the roundup of the most common issues people have with Airtable formulas, and also the kind of easy methodology to go through when you're troubleshooting. I've included links to the Airtable documentation about data types and some of the functions that we covered here, so check those out in the video description below. If you liked this video, I recommend checking out these videos here. And please, I'd love to hear your opinion on how I'm doing. Are the videos too fast? Are they too slow? Have I skipped a topic that you'd really like to hear about? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.